Hey, Tim Frisch with the Frisch Perspective here. Today I'm going to be doing another episode in my series on my favorite Bible translations. Now, I just have to say off the bat that my favorite Bible translations are actually the New King James Version and the Christian Standard Bible. So far, I've done a video on the New King James Version. It was actually 2 parts, so you can go back and watch those if you haven't already. But today I'm going to do one that's not necessarily in my top 2, but I really like this translation. It's very popular and people are very interested in it, and it's the English Standard Version, the ESV. Now, before I actually get into the topic of the ESV, I would love for you to subscribe to my channel and to like this video and comment below. I would really appreciate that because that helps spread and helps this channel to grow in its audience. But also, if you would like to help me make these videos and allow me to do what I'm doing, you can become a Patreon donor of my channel. And you can click on the link below in the description to see how you can become a Patreon supporter. So let me talk now about the ESV, the English Standard Version. This is a version that some of you have heard of and maybe some of you use all the time. Some of you don't know much about it. So I'm going to give a little background and then I'm going to talk about why it's so popular, because it's become very popular today. A lot of people are using it. And then I'm going to give a couple of things that I think might be maybe some downsides to the translation, but those are just a matter of my opinion. So let's dig into this, the English Standard Version. What's the background of it? Well, I've got a few Bibles here that I'm going to show you, and the first one is a King James Version Bible. The second is a Revised Standard Version, and then the third is the one that we're talking about today, the English Standard Version. Now, the King James Version, I've talked about this Bible a little bit in other videos. It is a very well-loved translation and highly influential in the English-speaking world, and it was finished in 1611 originally. So the King James Version is highly beloved. A lot of people have used it over hundreds of years. Well, this version eventually became kind of outdated in its English and scholarship from different people's perspective, and so they said we needed to have an update of this. And it was actually updated in England in 1881, and then it was updated for Americans in 1901. That became called the American Standard Version, the ASV of 1901. However, even that one was kind of seen as outdated by the middle of the 1900s, and so they said we need something fresher and more updated, but still updating the King James Version. And so that was done in early 1950s, 1952, and it was commissioned by the National Council of the Churches of Christ, and it was called the Revised Standard Version. So basically, the King James Version is the grandfather of the Revised Standard Version, and the Revised Standard Version is actually the parent or the father of the English Standard Version. The English Standard Version is actually an update of the Revised Standard Version. So it's kind of an update of an update of an update of the King James Version. That's what the English Standard Version is. The thing about the Revised Standard Version is that it was done at a time when there was a bit of controversy, and even today there's still controversy about Bible translation. Because after all, they're talking about replacing and updating the beloved King James Version. But what was particularly controversial is that some of the way that the Revised Standard Version creators talked about the King James Version was kind of negative. And I'll read that for you and show you in the preface of the Revised Standard Version. It says, "Yet the King James Version has grave defects. By the middle of the 19th century, the development of biblical studies and the discovery of many manuscripts more ancient than those upon which the King James Version was based made it manifest that these defects are so many and so serious as to call for revision of the English translation." So you can see why that would have ruffled a lot of feathers and caused a lot of problem back in the 1950s when this came out. It had a very negative view of the King James Version, at least in the way that it was expressing itself in the preface. And a little later it says, "The King James Version of the New Testament was based upon a Greek text that was marred by mistakes containing the accumulated errors of 14 centuries of manuscript copying." So again, the way that the Revised Standard talks about the King James Version it has such a polemic against it that I think it obviously raised a lot of negative feedback and negative response. And so that unfortunately put a real mar in the whole Bible translation situation that continues to this day. It was updated though, and it was called the New Revised Standard Version, which is still here today. But again, there is kind of this suspicion and idea that these translations have more of a liberal influence and bias. The New Revised Standard Version does tend to include more of the gender-inclusive language. Now, the English Standard Version, which is an update of the Revised Standard Version, doesn't have that negative polemic about it. And so when you actually read the preface of the English Standard Version, it puts itself in much more positive terms in relation to the King James Version. As time passed, the English language has changed. Various words and phrases in the King James Version have become harder to understand, so through the years, several new translations have been made. These include the English Revised Version, the American Standard Version, the Revised Standard Version. The English Standard Version Bible is part of this historic tradition of Bible translation. And it really, other than talking about updating the King James Version, really tends to look at itself as in the line of the King James Version in a very positive way. And so it doesn't have that negative vibe that you get from the Revised Standard Version. And the scholarship behind this really was conservative and tends to have a much more conservative feel in its approach. So that is a bit of a difference between the English Standard Version versus the Revised Standard Version and then the New Revised Standard Version, even though they are related. So the English Standard Version was actually produced by a publishing group called Crossway. I don't know how familiar you are with Crossway, but they are a really good, sound, solid Christian publishing group that puts out a lot of good literature. And they've really kind of been part of the resurgence that you'll see in evangelicalism, with kind of an emphasis on Reformed theology, or at least an appreciation for Reformed theology. And that happened early in the 2000s, and Crossway was a part of that resurgence, and they produced the English Standard Version in 2001, which was definitely adopted and used by a lot of groups that are Reformed leaning, or at least are appreciative of Reformed theology. And so the ESV has sometimes teasingly been called the elect standard version. But the Crossway publishers have done a great job in producing this since 2001. They've made it generously available, widely available in many good quality formats. So because it's a conservative approach to translation, it comes from the line of the King James Version, it's related to the King James Version, and it's so widely available and accessible because of Crossway publishers, it's really been a great success. It's now actually the fourth highest sold translation in the United States of America. So very, very successful. It's up there with the New International Version and the King James Version and the New Living Translation. It's right up there with them as one of the highest selling Bible translations. So what has made it so popular? Well, I've already hinted at it, but I just want to kind of go through some reasons here why the English Standard Version is so good and so popular. And one is Crossway, which I mentioned did a great job producing it, but they're very generous. If you go onto Kindle, if you like Kindle books and you want to get a Kindle version of the Bible, last I checked, you could actually, if you want a free copy of the Bible, you can get the ESV on Kindle for free. They just make it available. And I've noticed that with Crossway, that they do such a good job of putting their Bible into the hands of people at a very affordable price. And that leads me to the second thing, though. They're not only affordable, they're good quality. I mean, for the price you pay for this Bible here, this is as good or better quality than other versions of the Bible at the same price. And the quality is seen in how sturdy it is, but also the beauty of it. It just has a really good layout and a nice look to it. And the logo of the ESV, to the printing and the paper and the whole overall quality and look of the Bible is just top notch, and Crossway just does that over and over with their ESV Bibles. So any Bible you want to get, if you want to get a good looking Bible, ESV is going to be a good Bible. Also, as I mentioned, it's popular because people throughout the English speaking world in the last 400 plus years are very, very used to the King James Version. When they think of what a Bible should sound like, they think of the King James Version. So it's really advantageous and popular to have a translation that ties in with the King James tradition. And the ESV is an update of the King James. So if you like the King James, but you want something that is more modernized, then the ESV is a really good choice. And I think that's another reason it's been so popular. It's also, I would say, better written than some of the other updates of the King James Version. And what I mean is that when you take the translations that we have and you try to modernize them, some of them don't do as good a job as others. The American Standard Version and the New American Standard Bible, they're really good in terms of their translation philosophy. But a lot of people have complained that they don't read as smoothly in English or as clearly in English as the English Standard Bible does. And so the English Standard Version, while being an update of the KJV, still reads really well, and I would say overall uses good English. That being said, some people do complain that it has kind of weird wording because it still uses some of the wording of the King James Version. It is conservative, though, in its approach, and I could show you various examples, but basically what you'll see in the English Standard Version is they tried to be literal, and they were not trying to be trendy or gender inclusive and some of the other trends that you see today. They're more conservative in their approach. And the final reason I'll give as to why the ESV is so popular is because it's been endorsed by many good Christian teachers and leaders, and a lot of different churches have adopted it, and a lot of Christians enjoy reading it. And so it's popular because it's become very widespread, and a lot of people are using it and sharing it and incorporating it into what they do. And so the more that it gets used in the Christian world, the more widely accepted it is and more popular it becomes. So all I can say is the English Standard Version, Crossway's done an awesome job, and it is a really good, solid translation. So I'm happy that it's out there. It's a good, nice, updated version of the King James Version. Me personally, I like the New King James Version. I think that that's a really good update of the King James Version if you just want to have the King James in today's language. But I can understand why some people prefer the English Standard Version because it does use a different textual basis than the King James, which some people prefer, but it's also really readable for people today, and perhaps even more so than the New King James Version. Now, are there any downsides to the English Standard Bible? This is totally my opinion, but one of the issues is that the English Standard Version does get updated fairly often. Now, these are just minor updates. They're not updating a lot of the verses and words, but they do minor updates. And I think, in my opinion, they probably do that a bit too often. I know, for example, they did update it in 2011 and then updated it again in 2016. So just in the span of 5 years, it was updated a couple times. Now, they did actually, as a publisher, Crossway wanted to stop doing so many updates, and they had 2016, they called it the permanent text, and had thought that they were going to stop updating it. But then they quickly reneged on that and said, no, we want to be able to update it. And I can understand updating it at times to make sure that the language is very, in line with how we're using words today. But also if there's scholarship that is speaking into how we ought to translate something, I can understand wanting to update certain things at times. But I think that those updates should be few and far between. Another downside of the ESV, which is, again, actually a good thing in some ways, but it is an update of the King James Version, whereas I think if you're going to have a new translation, it's great to actually start from the originals and just give us a new translation. If you want the King James Version, read the King James Version. Or if you want it updated some, read the New King James Version. But to have a kind of a revision of a revision of a revision, I think, in my opinion, that's not my favorite thing. Although I do appreciate that it's in the line of the King James Version. But I think the CSB is really good for being conservative and being more literal, but being a very good Frisch translation. So that might be a negative, but again, a lot of people like it because of its tie to the King James Version. And the only other thing, as I mentioned before, is the textual basis of the ESV. The King James Version was based on what was called the Textus Receptus. It was the text of the Bible that was used, for example, throughout the Middle Ages in the church in the West. But with manuscript evidence, there were many scholars who felt that the Bible needed to be updated. Now, please understand, this doesn't change any major doctrine of the Bible, and I know it's a very controversial topic, but some people lean toward the more modern text that's been put together based on actually some more ancient manuscripts. And so the English Standard Version incorporates that modern scholarship and is based on that critical textual basis. Whereas the King James Version was based on what we now will call the Textus Receptus. So it depends on what you prefer. The New King James is also based on the Textus Receptus, as I believe is the modern English version. So for some people, they would actually prefer that and would want to read translations that are based on that. Others would rather read something like the ESV that's based on the critical text. And I think both have things that are good about them, and we should incorporate all of that scholarship. So I think it's good to have both kinds of translations. But that's a negative for some people. So that's kind of my overview of the English Standard Version. I hope that this has helped you understand the background of it and why it's so popular, and maybe some of the negatives, at least from my perspective. But I would love to hear what you think about the English Standard Version or any other Bible translations that you're using, some of the things you like about them, or maybe you have a question that you'd like to ask me and get my perspective on. I'd love to talk to you about that in the comment section. So please leave a comment, please like this video, and again, if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, do that. Spread the word, and I hope that you'll continue to watch my channel, A Frisch Perspective.